throughout the history of psychoanalysis, we have cult phenomena, right? We have incredible idealization of a particular contributor. We have the cult of Freud. We have the cult of Melanie Klein. And boy, are the Symingtons ever into the cult of Bion. It's an incredible idealization that they're producing in this book. And Robert Young was particularly offended by this idealization. In the preface, the last paragraph of the preface of the book quotes, "Psychoanalysis seen through Bion's eyes is a radical departure from all conceptualizations which preceded him. We have not the slightest hesitation in saying that he is the deepest thinker within psychoanalysis, and that this statement does not exclude Freud. If the reader registers no shock, if she is not flabbergasted to realize that all she has understood is now in the balance, if she does not gasp in horror to realize that she has to start all over again, then we have failed dismally in our task, and this book will have been a failure." I mean, come on. That is over the top. That's really over the top. I mean, they're trying to lay the Now, you need to know that Neville Symington was a Roman Catholic priest before becoming a psychoanalyst. And he has a continuing interest in the field of psychoanalysis and religion. In fact, I would say that basically he's trying to collapse the distinction between psychoanalysis and religion. And this religious element is coming across very much in this book. Robert Young is offended that the Symingtons haven't done their homework here. They haven't referred to other scholarly, comprehensive scholarly studies of Bion's work. Okay, so they themselves mention that the mainstream London Kleinians around Hannah Siegel and Betty Joseph and all of the others have a very divided attitude towards Bion. They accept Bion's work, all of his works, up to about 1963, well, including 1963, in which Bion published Elements of Psychoanalysis. The following book, Transformations, appears in 1965, and from that point on, the London Kleinians turn away from Bion. And they turn away from him because they have the feeling that he's becoming mystical. This is where he introduces the idea of O. The Symingtons, again, at the very beginning, they write that the only way of knowing psychic reality is through intuiting it, and of knowing O by becoming it. Okay, this whole idea of becoming O, this has a mystical overtone that the mainstream London Kleinians don't like. Okay, where do I situate myself here? I recognize these flaws and this excessive idealization that's going on in this book by the Symingtons, but unlike my friend Robert Young, I feel this is a very important book. I think that this book opens up an understanding of what Bion is about. I'm not so sure that Bion has to be understood as a mystic, although he even uses the word mystic. to describe the creative genius. I mean, he would call Freud a mystic. He would call Melanie Klein a mystic. Well, I think that's a misuse of the term mystic. That's a mystifying use of the term mystic. I don't think Freud was a mystic. I don't think Melanie Klein was a mystic. Whether Bion was or not, I'm not so sure. I think he certainly was a creative genius. I think the Symingtons exaggerate his genius. On the other hand, I think it would be a mistake to reduce Bion's work to being a mere elaboration of Klein's work. And I think that's what the London Kleinians try to do. I mean, they try to reduce Bion to another important figure in the Kleinian development. They try to reduce him to something like a Hanna Siegel. I think he's more than that. I think there's something pretty unique, a major contribution here that Bion makes. So I don't idealize him the way the Symingtons do, but I don't think he should be reduced either to someone who's just extending Kleinian thought a little bit. I think he is producing maybe not a new way of understanding what psychoanalysis is. Maybe it's not that completely radically new, but he clarifies. He clarifies what psychoanalysis is. One of the ways he clarifies it is his emphasis on truth. Okay? Now again, he's not unique in this. Freud himself in 1915 wrote, quotes, "Psychoanalytic treatment is founded on truthfulness. In this fact has a great part of its educative effect and its ethical value. Founded on truthfulness, and herein lies a great part of its educative effect and its ethical value," unquote. Bion writes, quotes, "Psychoanalytic procedure presupposes that the welfare of the patient demands a constant supply of truth, as inevitably as his physical survival demands food." Now, Bion is extending. I mean, Freud shares this emphasis on truth, but Bion is extending it. Bion is saying that the mind needs truth the way a plant needs water. Okay, and a mind that turns away from truth is a sick mind. One might even say a dying mind. I mean, again, what do we mean by death instinct? I mean, the mature Bion really doesn't use the concept death instinct, but I mean, I think he's describing many of the phenomena that other analysts have tried to get at with the concept of death instinct. I don't mean death instinct in the literal way that Freud proposed, a biologically based instinct to die. I'm thinking more of death instinct as most Kleinians have assimilated it, meaning something profoundly destructive in the mind, leading to disintegration or devolution instead of evolution. Now, Bion is talking about this. He talks about a progressive movement through the grid as opposed to a negative grid or a reversal of movement through the grid. Instead of mental growth, mental decay. Instead of evolution, devolution. This devolution is what a lot of people mean by death drive. Something deadening. Okay, instead of bringing things to life by working beta elements over with alpha function, we have the reverse. We have alpha elements turned back into beta elements. instead of the emergence of a subject. By the way, there are interesting parallels between Bion and Lacan. It's interesting at various points in our study of Bion to ask about comparisons with some of Lacan's ideas. But certainly, Lacan is talking about the birth of the soul or the self. And he says it's only by recognizing that I am not the specular ego. That is castration. I accept castration. I accept that I am not the image. Only then can I begin to experience myself as a subject. So there's an inverse relationship between the ego and the subject. To the extent that through analysis we deconstruct the ego, we grow in subjectivity. Bion is describing a similar process of growth of subjectivity, or growth of the self, or growth of the soul. Okay, this emphasis on truth. The mind grows through exposure to truth. Bion investigates the process through which truth evolves, and the process through which truth is blocked. Now, I don't know whether anyone says this, but this I think if you want to understand Bion, you have to understand that Bion's work is a careful study of the resistance. Now, there's an old concept in psychoanalysis, resistance. The idea that psychoanalysis, the ego psychologists see psychoanalysis as resistance analysis. Well, Bion is contributing majorly to resistance analysis. The analyst is creating a situation in which he is leading the patient or helping the patient evolve towards truth. But the patient doesn't want to evolve toward, well, a part of the patient does. A part of the patient wants to evolve towards truth, but a big part of the patient wants to evade truth. Truth evasion. Guilt evasion. Bion says neurosis and psychosis are the result of evasion of mental pain. If you want to avoid mental pain, you have to avoid psychic reality. Avoid truth. And Bion studies all of the many ways in which people block growth, evade truth. This, of course, when we talk about the links, the L and the K and the H links, love, hate, knowledge. And then, of course, we have minus L, minus H, and minus K. This is the evasion of psychic reality. So Bion is studying both the development and the degeneration of truth. The Symingtons point out that usually when people come to therapy, they come with a cover story. I'm coming to get rid of my symptoms, my headaches, whatever. But this is a cover story. What's the real reason they've come to analysis? Rarely do you have a patient who states it at the beginning. I'm here because I can't love. I'm here because I can't think. What is the analysis for Bion? The analysis is the diagnosis of the inner truth. They have a sentence here that I particularly like. A patient, referring to a particular patient, he poured out language from which thought was absent. He poured out language from which thought was absent. Now here we can make a comparison with Lacan. This is empty speech. This is what Lacan calls empty speech. And this is where, of course, Lacan cuts the session because the speech is empty. This is also what Heidegger means by idle talk. I think Lacan got the concept of empty speech probably from Heidegger's notion of idle talk. Patient poured out language from which thought was absent. Okay, Bion is interested in truth. Another reason I value his thinking is that Bion, unlike Freud and most psychoanalysts, does not cloak the fact that psychoanalysis is a moral enterprise. I mean, this quest for truth, Bion doesn't make it obvious, but this quest for truth in Bion is also a quest for goodness and love. I mean, last week I pointed out that I think Klein is in some ways superior to Bion because, like William Golding, Klein makes room for Simon, not just for Ralph and for Piggy. I pointed out that Bion is a rationalist like Freud in many ways, but I think that's not entirely fair. I do think Simon is present in Bion's thinking. And as part of his diagnosis of what's going on with the patients who come to us, Bion and the Bionians are pointing to such things as, well, here they mention a patient who, underlying this patient's symptom was not a dammed up sexual drive, they say, but a diabolical spitefulness. A diabolical spitefulness. Now that's a moral category. This is what's troubling the patient. Greed, envy. Well, here I guess Bion is with Klein. I mean, Klein sees at the root of mental suffering, she sees moral failure. Now that's an idea that Freud went out of his way to avoid. But it's there in Melanie Klein implicitly, and it's also there in Bion. Okay, one of the things that really offends Robert Young about this book is the way the Symingtons stereotype Freud, and they're very unfair to Freud. They're constantly talking about the way in which Bion transcends Freud, but they seem to be talking about the Freud of the turn of the century. They're talking about the younger Freud. They're talking about Freud the positivist, the materialist, the instinctualist Freud. Freud himself transcends that to a tremendous extent. There's no need to be, stereotyping Freud in this reductionistic way in order to point to Bion's contributions. And this is something that is offensive about this book, the way they misrepresent Freud and oversimplify him. It is possible to create a picture of Bion as simply a Kleinian. Much of what he has to say is really a repetition of the distinction between the paranoid schizoid and the depressive positions. But there's more going on here than a simple variation on Kleinian themes. The emphasis on helping the patient become more able to bear mental pain, to bear guilt, to bear regrets, to bear sadness. The change, they write, occurs in a decision. Now here's an existentialist element in Bion's thought. He doesn't point to existential philosophy, but there is an existential element to Bion's thought. He says a decision, that implies freedom, that implies choice on some level. He says the change occurs in a decision to face pain rather than evade it. The analyst can witness a patient changing from evading pain to facing it. Well, again, this is a movement from PS, evading pain, to D, facing it. But his way of referring to this as a decision. All neurotic suffering comes from a decision to be guided by the pleasure principle. And that means to get rid of pain. But a person can revisit and revise that decision and decide, well, I'm not going to live according to the pleasure principle. I'm going to face pain instead of seeking to discharge it, evade it. I'm going to face my guilt. I'm going to suffer my guilt. I'm going to suffer my anxiety. And this is Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard says we all, neurosis comes from fleeing from anxiety. Instead of bearing anxiety and moving ahead despite one's anxiety. That's another existentialist, Kierkegaard. And here Bion is saying something very similar. The phenomenon of someone moving from evading pain to acceptance of suffering is in direct opposition to the pleasure principle. Well, okay, that's true. But the Symingtons should now mention the small fact that in 1920 Freud wrote a book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. I mean, it's almost as if they're trying to say, well, Freud was stuck with the pleasure principle, Bion went beyond the pleasure. Well, so did Freud. Come on, let's give credit where credit is due here. Of course, even Julia Kristeva is a critic of Lacan. She posits the semiotic as opposed to the symbolic. Lacan has been widely criticized for not paying enough attention to affect, to emotion. Now, first of all, I have to say, I think that's an unfair charge against Lacan. He wrote a whole seminar 1 year on anxiety, which is an affect. It's not true that Lacan doesn't, it's not true that he has nothing to say about affect. That's an unfair charge. On the other hand, it is rather intellectualized in a lot of ways. Bion is almost the opposite. Bion is working very much on the emotional level. He's working with emotion. Now, of course, like most Kleinians, certainly would never agree that psychoanalysis is a talking cure. Because we work with emotions that are put into us by patients or induced in us by patients who use projective identification. The capacity to dream. Well, this is alpha function. Dreaming is applying alpha function for the creation of emotional meaning. Okay. Bion uses these categories, the finite and the infinite. I find that hard to relate to. Again, it's a language that I think encourages people to think of him as a bit of a mystic. I don't think it's necessary. Instead of talking about finite and infinite, I would use the terms concrete and abstract. The most intense flight from emotional truth is psychosis. It's because he can't face emotional pain that the psychotic attacks his own mind. He attacks his own mental function. In other words, the psychotic doesn't just blot out the painful message. He attacks the receiver. He attacks the capacity to receive the truth. Why? Because he feels the truth is so dreadful. Bion refers to nameless dread. Nameless dread. And he associates this with what he calls the ego-destructive superego. The persecutor, well, I mean, this is very Kleinian, okay? I mean, for Mrs. Klein, the child identifies with the bad part object, the persecutory object, and this is the core of the superego. The superego is a persecutor. All of the hatred and aggression that I can't contain, I project out into the bad object, and then I identify with the bad object. So we're talking here about a fundamental dread of persecution by a superego attacker. This is what is most feared. People vary in their ability to face emotional truth. Not everybody is as haunted by the dread of this monstrous superego. Not everybody's superego is so lethal, so murderous, so annihilating. I mean, the more emotional pain that has been evaded, I mean, the more trauma. The more trauma, the more projection of rage, the more intense is are the persecutory feelings, the more extreme is the persecutory superego, and the more that has to then be evaded by the evasion of emotional truth. How does he define O? Quotes, I shall use the sign O to denote that which is the ultimate reality represented in terms such as ultimate reality, absolute truth, the Godhead, the infinite, the thing in itself. They continue, O then has a metaphysical and religious meaning. Melanie Klein was indifferent to religion and philosophy. Well, no, she was very tempted to convert to Roman Catholicism at one point. She had some good friends who were Roman Catholics. She thought of conversion. She did not convert. But the Symingtons are very religion-friendly. As I said, Neville was a Catholic priest before becoming a psychoanalyst. And here is Bion using this language, absolute truth, the Godhead, the infinite. Now, religiously inclined psychoanalysts love this stuff. I wish he hadn't used that language. I wish he hadn't referred to the Godhead. I don't think we need to refer to the infinite. Ultimate reality is maybe okay. I mean, we have the Lacanian real, for example. And there's a connection here, I think. Between beta elements, the real, ultimate reality. But, you know, leaving all of these rather metaphysical and mystical words aside, at times Bion uses the concept of O in a very concrete clinical way, a useful clinical way. He says, as the analyst, our job is to try to apprehend the O of the session. Okay? Now that's not that different from James Strachey in 1937 in his classic paper, The Nature and Aims of Psychoanalysis. He says the analyst will do almost anything to avoid seizing the live wire in the session, touching the affectively loaded truth of the session. The analyst is tempted to avoid getting the point of the session. Yes, let's use that language, okay? What's the point of the session? What's the point of this session? You know, we will evade the point. Very often the patient is evading the point, and we are drawn into evading the point. Why? Because if we get the point and we put it into words, well, there's a risk. The patient might explode. The patient might storm out of therapy and never come back. The patient might have a psychotic break. The patient might physically attack me. I have all kinds of fantasies of the catastrophe that might happen if I touch the live wire, if I speak to the point. So, you know, we're tempted to evade the point. Well, that's what the O is. O is the point of the session. So let's not get distracted by these words, the Godhead, the infinite. Come on, we don't need that. Let's just follow Bion and think of O as, you know, what's the emotional truth of the session? That's what we're trying to get at. Again, though, there's this existential element. Bion is talking about a personal act of understanding. Preconception, seeking realization. Oh, by the way, one of the things that really offended Robert Young was this footnote on the bottom of page 10, where the Symingtons define what religious means to them. By religious, we mean a model of the human being as a creature with intentionality that transcends immediate physical needs. By religious, we mean a model of the human being as a creature with intentionality that transcends immediate physical needs. Well, Robert Young laughs at this. What atheistic humanist would not agree that human beings have intentionality transcending immediate physical needs? I mean, the Symingtons must have in mind some old materialist positivist of the 19th century here. All kinds of non-religious people see human beings as having intentionality transcending physical needs. That's a very weird definition of religion. Okay. The process of mental development is what Bion is trying to study, and its disruption by forces like greed and envy. Now here's this existential element that I like. This is about his character on page 22. They say, we believe that some insights, the Symingtons say, we believe some insights are only possible to the one in whom the values of truth and love are central. If the mind is healed by truth, then how can a psychoanalyst primarily motivated by desire for prestige, say, or power, say, manage to relay truth to his patients? We distrust, therefore, the theories of someone whose focal values do not correspond to a desire to achieve love, freedom, and pursuit of truth. Now, I completely agree with that. I would put it that the first thing in accepting people into training to be analysts, or accepting them to become training analysts, the first thing we should be diagnosing is whether they have a conscience. I mean, conscience is my identification with the good, loving, nurturing object, the nurturer. And because I have identified with the nurturer, I have a need to nurture. I mean, analysts should be people who are capable of love. That is, you know, they should not be excessively narcissistic, let alone psychopathic. I mean, the psychoanalytic movement has given psychoanalytic training to a good many psychopaths. This should not happen. Well, I think one of the reasons it's happening is that, you know, again, Freud merged conscience into superego. We should not be trying to assess whether a person has a superego. I mean, at its best, the superego is simply, internalizing rules and following rules because you're afraid if you don't, you'll get caught and castrated. That's what a superego is. I conform to the rules because if I don't, I'm going to get caught and castrated. Well, you know, that's not what we want to measure in people we're trying to assess for analytic training. We should be assessing whether they have a conscience. Are they capable of loving? So I think they make a really good point there. They talk about his simplicity, and this is really quite interesting what they have to say about simplicity as a character trait. The ability to be simple. This is something Lacanians lack. The capacity to be simple. I mean, that's the last thing that Lacan wanted to be.
It's not classy. You know, it's not classy to be simple.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
How about now?
Now I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. I said it's not classy for Lacan. It's not elegant enough.
No, it's not flashy, it's not classy, it's not elegant, it's not impressive. I mean, but Lacan is extremely narcissistic. I mean, you know, he's a brilliant narcissist, and you know, he is well worth studying. He has very good ideas. I have a good friend who is has done me the honor of reading my forthcoming book and made many helpful suggestions. And but the one part of my book that he can't stand is my chapter on Lacan, because the subtitle is Appreciation and Critique. He wants it to be just critique. He doesn't want any appreciation. But I have appreciation for Lacan, because Lacan had some very good ideas that we need to know about. Oh, one other, Nahale, you sent me the article, I forget the man's name, he's comparing Bion and Sullivan.
Yes.
That's a very good article. I particularly like the exercise in comparative psychoanalysis. I agree with that author that the way forward now for psychoanalysis is more and more comparative psychoanalysis. We need to compare Bion with Lacan. We need to compare Lacan with Carveth. All of these things, these discourses that take place in silos, we need to cross-fertilize. And we'll make very interesting discoveries, because there are very interesting parallels to be discovered. They say that the capacity to go to the heart of the matter is one of the attributes of simplicity. Yeah, I think that's right. The ability to just go to the heart of the matter, to call a spade, as we say in English, to be direct. Okay, so truth for Bion is not just empirical truth. It involves simplicity, it involves love, it involves honesty, it involves integrity. It is a value-loaded concept of truth. Okay, chapter 3 is called The Emotional Catalyst. And Bion is quite Kleinian. An emotional experience cannot be conceived in isolation from a relationship. Of course, this is what that man who is writing about Bion and Sullivan, he's talking about Bion as clearly an interpersonal, intersubjective, relational theorist. And of course, he studies the relation under these three categories of love, hate, and knowledge. L, H, and K, and then the reverse, minus L, minus H, minus K. And he points out that these are active phenomena. They're not passive phenomena. Love is active loving. Hate is active hating. Knowledge is the act of knowing. doing something to another, emotional activities, and these are linking emotions. He makes the distinction between knowing and knowing about. When Bion is talking about knowing, it's almost like in the biblical sense where we refer to a man knowing a woman, meaning having intercourse with her, knowing her. Very different from knowing about, which is just a collection of facts. And he's concerned about the degeneration of knowledge into minus K, evading knowledge. They say to come upon one's ruthless greed in relation to another is quite a different matter from intellectual awareness of it. There is a continuing decision to be made as to whether to evade pain or to tolerate and thus modify it. So I had a seminar early in my career. I was only a few years older than the students in the seminar, and we really enjoyed working with one another, and we would have very productive discussions. But there was one student who couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand being a part of this very productive, creative group. We were all thinking together in interesting ways, and he couldn't stand it. The more we thought productively, the more depressed he looked, until finally he would open his mouth, and something would come out. Reminds me of that earlier sentence, a stream of words from which thought was absent. I mean, what would come out would be incoherent, but it had the effect of killing the seminar. In the face of what he was saying, we all became depressed and confused, and we couldn't think anymore. He stopped us from thinking. It was like a green gas emitting from him that just anesthetized everybody in the seminar. It was an outpouring of beta elements. I had to ask him to leave the seminar. I had to deregister him as a student. He was killing the seminar. He couldn't stand it. I think the envy was just way too intense. He just was full of envy of the fact that we were able... Okay, here's how Bion would talk about this. He would say, for him, for that student, it was a primal scene. We were all having productive intercourse with each other. And we were making babies. Thought babies. We were having productive, pleasurable intercourse, and thought babies were emerging. And he had to kill the whole thing. He couldn't stand being witness to this productive primal scene. Now, of course, Bion internalizes the primal scene and makes this the essence of thinking. Thinking is intercourse. It's mating. Mating, a preconception with a realization leading to a conception. Two things come together, producing a third. A preconception meets a realization, and out of their intercourse comes a third thing, a conception. So, people were conceiving in this seminar, and he had to kill it. He had to abort it. He was an abortionist. Okay? Now, of course, sometimes people abort themselves, and that's what Bion is writing about, the ways in which we abort ourselves. And part of the reason we abort ourselves is that we can't stand the primal scene. I mean, if I'm starting to think productively, I'm starting to feel pregnant, I'm starting to feel like I'm going to deliver something new, But to the extent that I couldn't stand my parents having intercourse, and I couldn't stand having siblings born, I might have to stop my own pregnancy, my own creative process. I might have to undermine my thinking. This is a very useful way of conceiving of these things. You know, I think this is a major contribution to link mental activity with a kind of coupling, intercourse. I think Bion has, I'm glad that Bion went his own way, but I don't think that we need to stop being Freudian in order to be Bionian. Okay, that's again this tendency to create these silos. Why can't I be a Bionian Freudian? Why can't I be a Kleinian, Bionian, Freudian, Kohutian, Lacanian? There's no reason I cannot integrate these, what Bion would call vertices. I can integrate these vertices. I can shift creatively among them. So that I would never stop listening in the Freudian way. I mean, listening for condensation and displacement and decoding the session, decoding the dream. You don't. On the other hand, Bion contributes something fundamental about the dream. It's not just this thing to be decoded. That's fine if you're working with neurotic patients. You want to be decoding their dreams using Freudian principles. But if you're dealing with a psychotic patient, you don't want to be decoding their dream. Their dream is their attempt to, well, their dream is like the Lacanian synthome. Their dream is an attempt to integrate what has come apart. Like the Borromean knots have become apart. We have a popular song by a Canadian band, and the main line in the song is, "She's come undone." So the Borromean rings have come undone, and the synthome knits them together again. Well, in Bionian language, I mean, the dream is the attempt to use alpha function to achieve some degree of integration. But of course, the patient is at the same time opposing this, because if they pull their mind together again and achieve some integration, they're going to be confronted with some truth. And they're afraid that this truth is unbearable. They fear it's unbearable. Therefore, they don't want the rings to come together again. They don't want the mind to become integrated again. Anyway, yes, I don't think that Bion uses the unconscious in the way that Freud does, and I think that's too bad in a way. On the other hand, he had to go his own way to explore his full creativity. Okay, he's talking about the analyst should be trying to figure out what is the key emotional link in each session. Again, it's like that point of the point of the session. What's the key emotional link? Loving, hating, knowing, minus loving, minus hating, minus knowing. What's the key link? Is it a plus or is it a minus? Now, Bion is not talking about sitting in the session with the copy of the grid in front of you, trying to sort everything out. He makes it very clear that the grid is something only to be used after the session or when one is engaged in some kind of research. So we're not talking specifically about the grid, but I think the analyst is in his reverie trying to get a sense. This is part of trying to grasp the O of the session, the point of the session. Is it a love? Is it a hate? Is it a knowledge? What's the key link? And of course they're talking about music. They're using the metaphor of the key signature in a piece of music. Horizontal and the vertical axes. The key thing to keep in mind is that the vertical axis concerns the genetic development of thoughts, the genesis, the genetic development of thoughts, starting in the top left corner. The beta elements are the most primitive, and then we step to the alpha elements, and then we go to dreams, thoughts, myths, and then the preconception, followed by the conception, followed by a concept, then a scientific system, and then algebraic calculus. We're talking about the growth in abstraction, the growth in sophistication of mental functioning. Okay, we're talking about the evolution of the mind. The evolution of the mind from its primitive origins in beta elements through alpha to dreams and myths, to preconceptions, conceptions, theories, and so on. And of course, this is what we want to help our patients achieve. We want to help them grow mentally. They've come to us because they're stuck, or they have regressed, they have fallen back, or they're stuck. And through being with us, they're hoping that being with us will stimulate mental development again. Certain things. Now, of course, how do I stay alert? Here Bion is talking about receptivity. This whole theme in Bion of without memory or desire. This, again, of course, is Freud's evenly hovering attention. Let's not exaggerate the difference here. Freud was saying something very similar. He didn't say without memory and desire, but he said freely hovering attention. Same kind of idea. It's being receptive. Being receptive. I should clear my mind of other things. I should offer myself as an unsaturated preconception. Again, that's a Bionian idea, the distinction between saturation and unsaturation. I should come to the session unsaturated, with an open preconception, that is open to finding what will come from the patient. What will the patient say? What will the patient bring?